hi to everyone who's joining us. Thank you for coming along and joining this virtual program today for a very special live broadcast of Hidden Collections from the museum's archives, where shortly we will be joined by one of the museum's greatest treasures. And no, I am not talking about one of our logbooks or the Fresnel lens. I am talking about our own phenomenal and very special research librarian, Bo Van Riper. Bo will be sharing a new selection of discoveries and the stories behind them. But as you are all here with us today, feel free to ask questions as he goes along. If you have a burning question for Bo about some aspect about Vineyard history as well, please share those questions. And then when Bo is done presenting, he'll spend a little time answering the questions, and we can have a discussion after that. So feel free just to post questions down in the chat box, in the Q&A or the chat, either one, and we'll come and grab them after he's done. I do want to take a moment before we start to thank those of you who have supported the museum, whether through membership, through financial support, or through donations to the collection, some of which Bo is going to be talking about today. You are the reason that we can keep going, we can keep learning, we can keep caring for our island's history, and to keep sharing it with all of you, whether in person, hopefully more of that soon down the road, but for now, be it virtually. So without further ado, make yourself comfortable, enjoy that cup of soup you have, or coffee or tea, as Bo is going to take us back in time through our island's history. So Bo, take it away.
Thank you, Anna, and welcome everybody. Thank you for coming here on this rather less than beautiful Tuesday afternoon. And just wanted to make sure, do you all have an image on your screen? Okay, so there we go. So I want to take you today through 8 items from our archives, of which the first one is a picture of 2 people at the beach, though not particularly these 2 people. For those of you who are familiar with African American history in Massachusetts in the middle of the 20th century, you might recognize the gentleman in the T-shirt and the sunglasses as Ralph Coleman, the dean of the Black Theater movement in Boston, and also with his family, a longtime multi-generational summer visitor to Oak Bluffs. And if you're a fan of Oak Bluffs, you might recognize the old new Seaview Hotel looming over the wall there in the background, and the Seaview Pier just behind Coleman's left arm in the distance. Next slide, please. Same angle, same Inkwell Beach, same probably 1950s time period, same Seaview Hotel. In the background, the gentleman with his back to you is Richard Mitchell, and the woman in the amazing hat is his wife, Vivian. Richard and Vivian Mitchell are a part of the larger story of the Oak Bluffs African American summer community. And they bought their first house on the island just after World War II up on Pacific Avenue, and spent summers there through the late 40s and into the 50s, eventually with their 2 children who were pictured there in the center and left foreground. There are numerous pictures like this in private holdings, in the museum's archives, in our exhibits, and so on and so forth. But the one I particularly wanted to share with you, next slide please, is this one. That's Richard and Vivian in 1945, brand new to the Vineyard, sitting on top of one of the big glacial boulders on the beach at Gay Head. And their daughter Claire, the girl in the middle of the photo of the previous photograph, was kind enough to loan it to us and let us scan it for our archives. And I love the idea that we've got this, both for the reminder that there was a time when smoking a pipe as you sat on top of a glacial boulder at Aquinnah was not considered unusual, but also for the reminder that the African American story on the Vineyard may be centered in Oak Bluffs, but it's not only about Oak Bluffs. The African American story on Martha's Vineyard is everywhere, including on the beach at Aquinnah, where Richard and Vivian, young with their entire lives ahead of them and looking, I might say, very spiffy in their post-World War II swimsuits, could enjoy the sun and the sand and the surf just like any other summer visitor, which one suspects was what drew them to the Vineyard in the first place. Next slide, please. Richard and Vivian, when they went on that beach outing to from Oak Bluffs up to Gay Head in the years just after World War II, would have most likely driven along State Road, which past Nabb's Corner and the edge of Chilmark becomes South Road. And then, because why would you ever want to do something simply, becomes State Road again when it crosses the border into Gay Head, now Aquinnah, and heads on up towards the Lighthouse. This is a picture of State Road, somewhere in Chilmark, probably around Squibnocket, somewhere in the 1920s. If you were to take the original glass plate image from which this copy was made and blow it up, you could see Model A Ford pickup trucks in the background behind that big smokestack, which is the smokestack from the furnace that's being used to melt the asphalt that's being used, that melt the tar to make the asphalt to pave State Road for the first time. That's what made this picture worthy in somebody's eyes of being shot. This is modernity. This is paved roads, hard surface roads, coming to Up Island for the first time, coming to Up Island in the probably 1920s at a time when there was not yet electricity. That's 20 years out in Chilmark, 30 years out in Gay Head. But coming to Up Island at a time when the people who appropriated the money and made the rules locally and statewide recognized that the automobile was transforming life in Massachusetts, even in tiny rural communities on the west end of Martha's Vineyard. That famous shot of Harry Thacker Burley and 5 young people standing in front of the Gay Head light in the 1920s, the one with Dorothy West and her cousin Helene Johnson that we have in the Gay Head light exhibit, was taken likely at the far end of the decade from which this picture was part of the near end. They got there, Harry Burley and his young friends, most likely in an open touring car, one that would never have been able to make the trip, that you wouldn't want to have tried making the trip in, over the dirt, sandy, rutted roads that existed up Island prior to the 1920s. Paving the roads made Chilmark, made Gay Head that much more accessible to the world. It killed the day excursions by steamboats that used to come in at Cooper's Landing below the lighthouse. But it opened the doors to Gay Head tourism as those of us who were citizens of the 20th century knew it. It's still a long trip. It still seems like the far end of reality. It's still distant from the hustle and bustle of Vineyard Haven, Oak Bluffs, and Edgartown. But you can drive there and back easily in the middle of a day, and perhaps stop for a cookie at R.G. Humphrey's Bakery in North Tisbury along the way. For those of you who are Up Island buffs, if you think the house directly behind the smokestack looks vaguely familiar, good eye. It belonged to Josie West, the deaf farmer who posed for Thomas Hart Benton's famous portrait that now hangs in One Island Many Stories, and whose sister-in-law, Katie, lived in what's now the old part of the Chilmark Library and was the last native speaker of Martha's Vineyard Sign Language. Next slide, please. The single most famous event in the history of Gay Head is, of course, the wreck of the city of Columbus. So famous that it got written up in Frank Leslie's Illustrated Weekly. It got written up in the National Police Gazette, an incredibly popular, if ever so slightly disreputable weekly publication that covered sporting news and scandal and sensation and violent death. This was the cover of the Police Gazette the week after the city, 2 weeks after the city of Columbus was lost. And I wanted to show it here because really there's never a bad time for some good old-fashioned 100-proof 19th century melodrama. I mean, it's a shipwreck, so you've got waves and a submerged deck and people, the guy with his hands up in the center left there, being swept to their deaths in the icy waters. But you've also got this poor woman in the foreground who, in a feat of biomechanics that only exists on the covers of 19th century periodicals, is holding the rope with one crooked arm, which is also supporting one of her children, and she's reaching fruitlessly for the body of her son who's being swept away in the waves. Now, whether an incident like this happened on the city of Columbus, the illustrator didn't know. We don't know. We do know that all the women and children on the city of Columbus died for reasons that are another story for another day. But note both that the illustrator here is going not just for crank the pathos up to 11, this poor woman watching her child be swept away to drown, and help was to prevent it. But note also that the illustrator is not above combining death and destruction and the pathos of the woman watching her child drown with, for lack of a better word, a little gratuitous sex. I mean, note that she's wearing a shoulder-bearing nightgown. It's January, for God's sake. She was sleeping in an unheated cabin. That woman would have been flannel from ankle to neck, sure as I'm sitting here. But for the purposes of the image, she's wearing a thin, filmy, shoulder-bearing nightgown, which is obligingly, in the midst of this raging January gale, dropped off her shoulder, bearing her entire arm all the way up and her shoulder all the way up to the neck. When I said the Police Gazette was mildly disreputable, it was because it wasn't afraid to acknowledge that sex, violence, and people's interest in such things were part of 19th century culture, something that the more genteel publications like Frank Leslie's, let alone The Atlantic, would never dream any more than the Gazette in those days would have dreamed of acknowledging it. But the Police Gazette knew what sold papers, and so this was their image of the wreck of the city of Columbus. A gentle reminder from the land of the archives that cheap sensationalism did not enter American journalism when the National Enquirer started publishing. Next slide, please. Nor, I should hasten to add, did the photo op. You've probably seen this picture, if only because it's part of the shipwrecks exhibit in the Lower Fresnel Gallery depicting the city of Columbus. This is the second boat crew that took the Massachusetts Humane Society lifeboat out to the wreck in an effort to rescue survivors. The guy in the stern, the boat captain is James Mosher, a 19th century kinsman of Lucy Mosher Vincent, she of the library and the beach. The other 5 gentlemen are all Wampanoag sailors from Gay Head. That's Leonard Vanderhoop at the far left, seated in the back. Mosher was the only white man among the 2 boat crews. Everybody else who rowed out to the city of Columbus from the shore, battling the waves, battling the wind, battling the freezing temperatures, was a Wampanoag resident of Gay Head who, when Horatio Pease, the assistant keeper of the Lighthouse, said, "There's a steamer aground on Devil's Bridge," said, as people have said on the Vineyard since time immemorial, "Okay, I'll go." The thing I wanted to call your attention to here is not just, my God, what did it take for somebody to climb into an open boat in sub-freezing temperatures with the seas and the wind running in Vineyard Sound and say, "I'll go." But also, it's easy to overlook because we see the faces, we see the setting, we think of the context, and we're drawn in by the drama of it all. It's easy to overlook the fact that this photo is posed. Sometime after the wreck, they pulled the boat down on the beach, and photographer John N. Chamberlain set up his camera on the sand and said, "Okay, guys, climb in the boat, pick up your oars, and look determined." And so they did. He shot another picture with the first boat crew posed in the same boat, in the same position, and printed them on cardboard stock as cabinet cards and sold them like proverbial hotcakes. Because when you were a professional photographer in those days, taking pictures of prominent landmarks, prominent events, and selling them to interested members of the public was part of how you made your living, along with going to people's homes and stores and saying, "Hi, would you like me to take a picture of the interior of your house, or you, or your family, or your dog, or your business?" The reason there are so many copies of this photograph out there is that Chamberlain shot it for the specific purpose of mass producing it, knowing that there would be interest in the story of the wreck and the story of the heroism of the rescuers. It doesn't for a minute detract from the heroism, from the tragedy of the wreck, or from the beauty of the photograph as a photograph, to note that this is a photo op circa 1891. Next slide. And speaking of photo ops, the gentleman in the middle there is Lincoln Pope Jr., the first Black Democrat elected to the Massachusetts state legislature. He's shaking hands with a former haberdasher in Missouri who went on to have a political career. Next slide, please. And here meeting an unsuccessful PT boat captain who also went on to have a political career. Next slide. There's Representative Pope leaning his arm on the back of the chair of Foster Furcolo, which if I'd had 5 more minutes before this, I would have reminded myself who the hell Foster Furcolo was, but at least he was kind enough to autograph the bottom of the picture, so I know that is his name. Let me just say that you could have a field day doing a write the thought balloons for the 5 people in this picture exercise, but let's not go there. Next slide. And there's Representative Pope with Francis Cardinal Cushing, the head of the Boston Archdiocese, on the right, and some guy who cosplayed Ronald Reagan at Halloween on the left. These are 4 out of 36 pictures that Representative Pope's family donated to us a few years back. And they're all, by and large, along these lines. Anybody who's ever been in politics or PR recognizes this as a classic grip and grin, that grip and grin PR shot. Here you are in the presence of a famous and important person. But here's the thing. I didn't grow up in Boston in the 1950s. Heck, I wasn't even born in the 1950s in Boston or anywhere else. JFK, Harry Truman, Foster Furcolo, thank you for the autograph, Mr. Furcolo. Cardinal Cushing, I can recognize. The guy on the left in this picture, and most of the people in most of the other 32 pictures of Representative Pope, I have no clue whatsoever. So think of this as a plea. If any of you out there remember Boston in the 1950s, remember Boston politics in the 1950s, or are just a Massachusetts political buff and would be interested in trying to help the museum put names to the once famous faces in these pictures with Representative Pope, shoot me an email at bvanriper@mvmuseum.org or get in touch with me through the website, because I could sure use your help. Next slide, please. This is a map. Specifically, it's a map of Westchop drawn in 1869 for the U.S. Lighthouse establishment, the organization of the federal government that before the lighthouses were overseen by the Coast Guard, took care to see that they were maintained and looked after and oversaw the keepers and assistant keepers who tended to them. This is a picture specifically of the Westchop Lighthouse. And next slide, please. I wanted to zoom in on it to call your attention to a couple of things. The first is that inside that red oval in the right center is the current Westchop Lighthouse that we all know and love. Now look at the blue oval, way up there, the very tip of Westchop. That's the original Westchop Lighthouse, the rubble stone tower that was built in 1817, and then prior to the Civil War, disassembled, moved, and reassembled 1,000 yards southeast, where essentially the current tower now stands. We know that the Gay Headlight famously was moved in 2015 to keep it from going over the edge of the cliff. We know that the Cape Pogue light has been moved at least 4 times, the last by Army heavy lift helicopter in 1987, to keep it from going over the edge. What's less often remembered is that the Westchop light, too, was moved, and if it remained where that blue oval is, it would have gone over the edge long since. A little bonus geography. The blue line represents the road to the original Westchop light, and you can see that the road to the new Westchop light, when it was set up there in the 1840s, was just a fork off the existing Lighthouse Road. The extension of Main Street and Holmes Hole, now Vineyard Haven, that we think of as the road to the Westchop light, wasn't built until the 1880s. We know because we've got the records in the Town of Tisbury record collection that talks about the dimensions and lays out the timetable for constructing it. But if you've ever driven out Main Street and at the corner of Fairfield and Main, seen a dirt road angling off into the woods that has a hand-painted wooden sign on it saying that it's Old Lighthouse Road, and you've ever wondered what the heck Old Lighthouse Road meant, it meant just what it said on the sign. Until the 1880s, that was the road to the lighthouse, the blue line and then the blue and red line shown on this map. Next slide, please. There's the red oval again, and Westchop light as it was in 1869. And that blue blob just below it is Point Pond. That bump out of the West Chop coastline just below the oval was called Low Point. And just inshore, just to the west of Low Point, there was a small pond that, if you can see the little nipple at the bottom of the pond there, was connected to the ocean by a tiny channel. It used to be that fishermen would pull their boats in through the channel and use Point Pond to shelter them from the storms. But by 1900, the barrier beach separating Point Pond from Vineyard Haven Harbor had been breached by storms and worn away, and Point Pond disappeared. If you line up maps of West Chop through the 19th century and into the early 20th, Point Pond eventually, a little after 1900, pops out of existence. All we have left is one photograph. Last thought, outboard of Point Pond, eastward into the shallows just off the tip of West Chop, there are two rocks. And in this map, you'll notice that just eastward of the northernmost rock is a buoy. Even then, there was a buoy, as Red Nun number 4 exists now, to warn people, hey, there's a rock here, don't hit it. Also, if you've ever wondered why West Chop Light has a red glass panel, so that when you're in a certain relationship to it geographically, it flashes not white but red, that's why. When you can see the red sector of West Chop Light, you're in danger of running onto the flats at Low Point and hitting the rocks off of where Low Point Pond used to be. Next slide. We all know what the Jaws poster looks like. Gigantic shark, ambiguously nude woman, and one of the great pieces of visual layout ever created in Hollywood. There are thousands and thousands of these posters, original, reproduction, large, small, printed on linen, printed on God knows what, available for purchase at a variety of fine internet retailers. We even have one in the collection, thanks to a donor who gave it to us as part of a collection of Jaws memorabilia. And then there's the poster in the next picture. Printed at DeRosa's, purple ink on rough laid gray paper, used to advertise the island premiere of Jaws on June 20th, 1975. They sold out the Island Theater twice over in the Edith Blake slide collection, photo collection, which includes dozens of photographs from the production of Jaws. You can see the people lined up outside the theater. We've got this poster, which was printed only in the scores, perhaps a few hundred. They sold them as souvenirs at the premiere showing. This was the one that I gave them $1 for and then stuck in the corner of a closet for years and years until it occurred to me that the museum might want it. This poster is the definition of ephemera, something that was meant to be temporary, something that was never meant to last. And when you're an archivist, when you're a librarian, when you're a curator, when you're a researcher, you always catch your breath a little bit when somebody hands you one of these and says, hey, do you have one of these? Do you want this? Found it in the back of a closet. Because the odds against something like this surviving, something that like this that was intended to be temporary, that was intended to be torn down and thrown away, because when this event happened, nobody knew that they were witnessing a sea change in how Hollywood made movies. Nobody knew that they were witnessing the first modern summer blockbuster. Nobody knew that they were seeing the rise to superstardom of some scrawny California kid named Spielberg, who, yeah, did that thing with Dennis Weaver in the tanker truck a couple of years ago. But really, I mean, come on, he's in his, what, 20s? How good could he be? Now, a lot of people, including me, stumbled out of the Island Theater that night realizing how good he could be. But nobody knew that when this poster was printed, so they're few and far between. But not a patch compared to the next slide, please. Next slide, please. Compared to a ticket used, you'll note it was punched, for the 9:30 premiere showing of Jaws on that Friday night in 1975. Who saves their movie tickets, let alone their bent, cheaply printed on thin blue cardboard tickets from a benefit showing from some movie about a shark that you're going to see because it was shot where you spend your summers? Well, thank you, Allison Shaw, for saving yours and giving it to the museum. Next slide, please. If you saw Jaws then or at some subsequent point, you may remember the scene the morning after the midnight attack that opens the film, where Chief Brody's been called to South Beach and he's talking to the long-haired blonde wonk who, because he was too stoned to put one foot in front of the other, didn't wind up getting that nude swim with the cute blonde, but also wound up not getting turned into sushi on the dune line at South Beach. So he had that going for him. The two heads, even with the surf line here, are Brody, played by Roy Scheider on the right, and Blonde Wonk, played by some random bit player on the left. The other 18 people in this shot are the people who make the magic happen. If you remember that scene, it's shot as Brody and the blonde dude against a wide open empty beach and a wide open empty sea. Well, this is Edith Blake with her trusty 35 millimeter still camera standing up on the dunes and showing you what it took to shoot that scene. Guys to lay planks for the camera dolly, guys to push the dolly, guys to operate the camera, a person to the picture's left of the camera operator holding up a boom mic, guys on the other side running the gigantic Hollywood-style lights, because even when you're shooting in full daylight, sometimes you need extra light. And beyond these 18 people are probably 30 more stretched out back along the dunes to the road on the parking lot, running, among other things, the generator truck that's supplying the current to run the light, and you get the idea. This picture, too, one of thousands that Edith Blake shot in the 70s and the late 60s and the 80s. This picture is a different kind of ephemera. The picture itself is one of a kind, but also durable. But the moment it captured, the scene it captured, existed for a few hours one spring day in June of 1974. And then the dolly was rolled away and the planks were taken up and the sand was left for the waves to wash over it. And the moment would never come again. So thank you, Edith Blake, for being there to capture it and showing the world forever after what the Vineyard looked like when Jaws came to make the Hollywood magic happen. Next slide, please. Edith Blake didn't just shoot Hollywood people making movies. She didn't just shoot the Kennedy-Kopechne hearings in 1960, the fall of 69 and January of 70. She didn't just shoot the Edgartown Regatta, although she did all those things. She also took hundreds of beautifully composed slice of life shots like this one. And At this point, you may be looking at it and going, yeah, okay, 3 teenagers on a sailboat. So what? Does the girl sitting on the boom go on to win 3 Olympic gold medals sometime in the late 90s? Does the kid at the tiller grow up to be somebody we should know? Like, I don't know, junior senator from Wisconsin or best-selling novelist or the next Steven Spielberg? I have absolutely no idea. I don't know who any of these people are. Although if you said to me, I think the guy at the tiller is Nevin Sayer, future professional windsurfer, who's going to marry a Swedish competitive sailor who opens a dress shop in Vineyard Haven, I wouldn't tell you you're wrong. Might go ask Nevin, hey, is that you, dude? But I don't know who they are. I don't know even what kind of boat it is, although I've got a guess. But it's the kind of photograph that historians of a certain geeky cultural history bent, like me, cherish. And here's why. There is absolutely nothing remarkable about any of those 3 people in the moment that's being shot, which means that it perfectly captures what people of that age and generation wore when they went sailing in that era. Nobody's wearing non-skid boots. Nobody's wearing wetsuits or Gore-Tex jackets. Hell, nobody's even wearing a life jacket, because in those days, the culture was you wore a life jacket when the race committee required it, or when it was blowing hard enough that not wearing a life jacket would be colossally stupid. The idea that you should always wear one, in the same way that you should always wear a helmet when you're on a motorcycle, or always wear a safety harness when you're working in high places, hadn't penetrated the small boat sailing world in those days, nor had the idea that you would sail in something other than your regular old go to the beach, go wade in the water clothes. To anybody who came up through high school, yacht club, collegiate sailing from the mid-'80s on, this looks, I suspect, as weird and alien as people in leg of mutton sleeves and high button shoes and parasols must have looked to the kids in this photograph. The world changes in 1,000 ways as history moves forward, and things that seemed utterly normal once upon a time, as these clothes and this way of going sailing would have to the people in this picture, become incomprehensibly alien without us even realizing it, until we look back 30, 40, 50 years and see ourselves as we were then. Which is why all those seemingly ordinary shots of people doing seemingly ordinary things 50 years ago are so incredibly valuable and incredibly important and incredibly worth saving. Next slide, please. Everybody knows that a 19th century handwritten whaling log that went around the world in the captain's cabin of a 3-masted ship is valuable. Everybody, if they found this in grandma's trunk in the attic or in the back of a drawer in some dusty corner of the house, would go, oh my gosh, this is incredible. What an astonishing historical artifact. And rightly so. This is the log of the bark Hecla, Hecla, which Wikipedia helpfully informs me is the English spelling of a volcano in Iceland. It may also be a minor Greek deity It's also what you call the loudmouth in the back row who yells obnoxious things when you're trying to do your stand-up act in South Boston. Yeah, it went okay, but I had to deal with a heckler. Sorry, not really. But I want to finish today by taking a slightly deeper dive into this log as an artifact. Notice the last line on this title page: sailed August 31st, 1869, on a sperm whale voyage. Which is in 1869 a little like saying, I'm going to go to Farm Neck and hit a bunch of holes in one. Possible, but unlikely. I mean, 50 years earlier, the Nantucket whaling captains routinely went out looking for sperm whales and sperm whales only. Right whales, bowhead whales, anything else they didn't think was worth their time. Sperm whale oil was worth more money. Sperm whales were the most valuable targets. Sperm whales were what they wanted to hunt. And they did, to the point where sperm whales numbers declined sooner than that of any other species. So to say in 1869, I'm going on a voyage for sperm whale specifically, not just I'm going whaling and, if God's with us and we're lucky, maybe we'll get a bunch of sperm whales. This is either astounding self-confidence or vaulting hubris, or both. But there it is, right on the first page. Next page, please, or the next slide. The captain's name is Smith. The logbook keeper's name is Smith. Now, okay, Smith, if their name had been Van Riper or some other weird name, it would have been even more striking. But nepotism was a thing then too. And so you wonder, was Smith, who kept the logbook, Captain Smith's brother, his son, his cousin? Was he chosen to be on the voyage because if you were going out after whales, you wanted people you could trust, people whose skills were known to you? You wanted, for example, a logbook keeper who had handwriting that looked like this? Maybe. Maybe that's why. It's certainly a soluble question. Next slide, please. This is a pretty standard log entry. It starts with a description of where the ship is in general, cruising in the North Atlantic, makes remarks about the weather, the state of the sea, whether they'd seen any whales. Well, they saw a small blackfish, which is like you go out for a 40-pound bass and you come back with a 18-ounce scup. I mean, you saw fish, but it was not impressive. And ends with the latitude and longitude. Logbooks are full of entries like this, page after page, and on and on and on. But next slide. And they have a certain set of conventions to them. Watches employed variously about the ship's duty. Total boilerplate sentence. The watches, that is to say the crew, were divided into shifts that they took turns working and resting, employed variously about the ship's duty. That stuff that sailors do when they're at sea, yeah, the crew was doing that stuff. Nothing to see here. We couldn't find any whales, so they're doing the work that needs to be done. Keepers of whaling logs developed the convention of ending every log entry, "So ends this day." You can imagine little Laura Jernigan's dad teaching her that when she was keeping her own journal, because all of her journal entries end so with her variation, "Goodbye for today." Log after log after log ends every entry with "So ends this day," except log keeper Smith here, who just shortens it to "So ends." because if you're writing it every damn day for 4 years, why not? Next slide. If you've looked at whaling logs, either in person or on the Internet Archive website, where 109 logbooks from our collection are digitized and available for free, you may have seen whale stamps. This carved out of wood, coated with ink, and stamped into the page of the logbook. A whale tail indicates we saw a whale, but he got away, we didn't catch it. This was the Hecla having an unlucky day. Next slide. A full-bodied whale, especially one spouting blood, means woohoo, we caught it, we brought it back, we cut it in, we turned it into saleable commodities. Notice that the outlines of this one have the square head of a sperm whale. They were at least making good on their boast. Indeed, every whale stamp in the Hecla's log is, as far as I can tell, a sperm whale. That was one of their lucky days. Next slide, please. And then there are the unlucky days. Some whale stamps came made in such a way that they left you with a blank spot in the middle to record, say, the number of barrels of oil that it had generated. The middle whale here is just annotated with the melancholy word lost. They had it chained up alongside the ship, and they were getting ready to slice the blubber off when the chains broke and the whale drifted away and sank. So they caught 3 whales that day, but only got to cut in and boil down 2 of them. This is the only case I've ever seen of somebody annotating a whale stamp, not with evidence of success, but with evidence of failure. Next slide. And every so often you get something like this. The writing there says, hands employed fitting the rigging to the main top gallant mast. The masts on big sailing ships came in sections, in part because trying to find a tree big enough and sturdy enough to make the entire mast out of, much less erect a mast that tall all in one piece, was prohibitively difficult. So the masts came in sections that overlapped at the ends where they joined. The main mast socketed into the keel and went up a story or 2 above the deck where it joined the top mast, and above that, the top gallant mast, although it's written out here top gallant, but an actual 19th century sailor, employing the tendency of 19th century sailors to leave out as many consonants as humanly possible, would have called it just the topgallant mast, as the forecastle was the forecastle, and the edge of the boat, of the edge of a small boat, which looks like it should be pronounced gunwale, was pronounced gunnel. If you ever wondered why all Massachusetts towns are pronounced with about 2/3 of the letters they're spelled with, I blame sailors. Now, anybody who could ever have been imagined in the 19th century to be reading a whaling log knows full and damn well what a topgallant mast looks like. There is absolutely no practical reason to draw that little picture of a topgallant mast and the cap that joined it to the top mast and the yard arm and the sail and the rigging to illustrate the log entry. But man, it's boring when you're out at sea and not seeing any whales. And if you're the log keeper and you've got this little bit of space in the log, why not? Some logs have pictures of islands, pictures of ships, pictures of a funny animal somebody saw on shore when they were refilling the water barrels. Log keeper Smith on the Hecla decided for whatever reason that notation about fixing the topgallant mast rigging needed a picture to go with it. And there it is, 150 years later. Next slide, please. Logs were sometimes reused. In this case, it was reused for a second and then a third voyage on board different ships. This is one of the early pages in the log of the Minnesota out of Edgartown, kept in the same book as the log of the Hecla out of New Bedford, even though different ship, different voyage, different captain. How the book itself got passed along, not a clue. Clearly, it's something other than Log Keeper Smith doing the writing because A, the ink is blue rather than black. B, the style is much looser, much less, I used to work in a bank, neat. And also notice that instead of stamps, that's a hand-drawn whale, and a baleen whale at that. Whatever the Minnesota was after, it wasn't restricting itself to sperm whales only. Next slide. And then there's this. Hat tip to Alice Goyer, library volunteer, who is working on cataloging imagery and other interesting things in whaling log books in our collection, who pointed me at this page a couple of weeks ago and said, Bo, have you ever seen anything like this? And the answer is no. In point of fact, I have never seen a full-length picture of a woman in an elaborate 19th century dress and hat pasted smack dab into the middle of the page of a whaling logbook. Next slide, please. And if you look at it, it is pasted. There are a lot of logbooks in our collection that were, after the end of the whaling era, turned into scrapbooks, or here, kids, if you want to color or do your homework on the blank pages at the back, go for it. And some of those have cutout pictures from magazines or the lithographed Sunday supplements of newspapers pasted into them, but that's not what this is. Because, forgive me, but look at the words either side of her hips. The line below her left elbow commences, and then on the other side of her, picks up with calm at, and then picks up again in the next line back on the left side of her, 4 bells, etc. That woman's picture was in that page of the log before the log got reused for the second voyage, the voyage of the Minnesota. Do I have a theory of how that happened? Yeah, I do, but it takes more investigating. But I'm going to end with that image as a way of saying this is part of what's endlessly fascinating about the archives, even of a modest size or museum like the MVM. Nobody, not the chief curator, not me, not even Art Railton, my predecessor as editor of the museum journal, who was at it for nearly 30 years and probably spent more time in the archives than any other single human being in the history of the organization. None of us know everything that's in there, not even remotely. And you never know when the next folder you open is going to reveal something completely beyond your experience, like a photograph of an impeccably dressed 19th century woman in black, casting a gaze over her shoulder out of the middle of a logbook kept aboard the Bark, Minnesota, somewhere in the Pacific, somewhere in the late 1870s. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. And if we have questions, I'll be happy to take a shot.
Thank you, Bo. That was wonderful. We do have one question that came in through the question and answer, but it has a couple of parts to it. So it is from Liz Adams, who incidentally in the world of small world connections says that she went to school with Nevin Sayre and lives in his father's house in Cambridge. So there you go.
Oh my gosh.
Whether or not that actually is Nevin in the picture. So Liz's question is around the archival collecting plan and wanted to know a little bit more about it. Specifically, what are the gaps that you hope to fill in now and in the future with acquisitions into the archives? So we'll start there.
That's a great question. And the big picture overarching, we actually do think about this stuff and have a plan. Answer is the three biggest gaps in our collection, with our archival collections, without a doubt, are, on the one hand, traditionally underrepresented communities: African Americans, Wampanoag, Portuguese, Brazilians. Of the Brazilian community on Martha's Vineyard, we have literally not a single archival document, not a single bit of ephemera to chronicle their lives and histories and contributions to the vineyard. We criminally underserve in terms of archival materials the African American population of the vineyard, despite the fact that their history on the vineyard goes back centuries, and their history as a key part of the summer community goes back now 120, 130 years. And so we're aggressively working on how best to fill in those gaps by reaching out to the communities involved, encouraging them to talk to us and to see us as people to consider letting be stewards of their families and their communities' memories when they're ready to pass it on to somebody else. The second huge gap is visually the period between that era when Edith Blake was shooting the filming of Jaws and Random Teenagers on Sailboats, back about 50 years to the mid-1920s. I have a theory which is based on absolutely no data except for looking for things in the photo archive, which is that if a picture gets old enough, if it's printed on, like that John Chamberlain shot of the City of Columbus rescue crew, if it's printed on mounted on a cardboard thing and it's sepia toned and it's got beautiful curly Q script on the back, it immediately reads as old and historic and important, and people save it and people ask us if we want it. If it's the equivalent of Richard and Vivian Mitchell sitting on that boulder at Gay Head, people look at it and go, and God bless Claire Mitchell, whatever her married name is now, which I forget, I apologize, Claire, for realizing that we might like to have a copy of it, because it's so easy, and I'm guilty of this too, to look at a random photograph taken of you or some member of your family on the vineyard in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and go, that's just Aunt Minnie in front of the ice cream store. And so they toss it in the shoebox or toss it in the trash, as I have done with more photos than I wish to consider of my family photo collection. But it means that after about 1920 and down to the 1980s, our photo collection has this gigantic donut hole. And people will ask me, do you have a picture of thus and such thing that happened in the 50s? And I'm like, you know, if it had happened in the 1880s, chances are excellent. 1950s, not so much. So yeah, I am on this relentless campaign to say to everybody I meet, if you're throwing out your family's old vineyard photographs, give them to me instead. We need them. We'll feed them and water them and no, not really water them. We'll feed them and take good care of them and put them in acid-free sleeves. There, that's better. Now Bonnie can stop having a heart attack. And the third thing is not specifically visual, but archival is things that document the lives of working people of whatever race, whatever ethnicity, and whatever era. We know a ton about the school teachers and the clergy and the whaling ship owners and the politicians. We know next to nothing about the ladies who ran the boarding houses and the guys who worked in the machine shops. We know a lot about the captains and nothing about the crews. We know that there are pictures of grocery stores with guys in aprons standing behind the counter, but we don't know what their lives were like because, well, for a lot of reasons. Documenting your life is an artifact of privilege. Having the money for a camera, having the leisure time to keep a journal, having the energy at the end of your working day to think about recording your thoughts or saving some bit of paper that might tell the world 100 years on what your world was like. We know that those documents are out there, that time and chance has somehow preserved them, and that they're still sitting in the back of somebody's drawer waiting to be discovered. But when I'm not trying to do my bit for representation of underserved communities or representation of visual imagery from the great donut hole of the mid-20th century, I'm trying to figure out how to find those documents that capture the way the other 90% live. And that's a really long answer to a really short question, but if you haven't figured it out by now, this is an answer cleverly disguising a pitch to all of you. We are out there, we are looking for this stuff, spread the word. We are not just looking for the impeccably preserved 19th century studio portrait. We're looking for the shot of Aunt Minnie in front of the ice cream store with the top of her head or the top of her double scoop strawberry cone cut off. This too is the stuff of history.
So we're just at our time together, but to close it up, we do have a comment from our dear friend June Manning. Hi, June, who's joining us.
Hey, June.
Wanted to just say she had a little bit of information about Foster Ferkalow, in case all of you had the burning desire of learning more. He was a Democratic governor of Massachusetts. He most likely served in the 1950s. I have a photograph of him with our grandfather, Captain Walter W. Manning, who served as a selectman for the town of Gay Head for a total of more than 50 years. Amazing man. She says when she unpacks, she will be sure to get you a copy. Thank you so much, June.
Thank you very much, June. And let me just say, if you had a question about today's program or about the Vineyard, about Vineyard history in general, and we didn't get to it, I believe I saw my email address go by in the comments at one point. Feel free to email me your question. Answering people's questions is a heck of a lot of fun, and B, it's why they pay me the big bucks. So yeah, bring it on. And thank you all for being part of this. Thank you, Anna, for being the most graceful host in Zoomdom. Thank you, Savannah Berryman Moore, wizard of the control room, who makes me look good in a way that if I was trying to share my own screen, I would look like an octopus tumbling down a flight of stairs. And thank you again, everybody, for coming. We'll see about doing this again in the new year.
Yes, yes, we will. We would like to continue this. Savannah is going to be sending out a survey to all of you who attended. So if you did like this live format with Bo, we'd love to continue it, and we would love to hear from you, your thoughts about this program. So please stay in touch again, and hopefully we'll see you again soon. Until then, please, all of you, stay well, and may you have a good and safe holiday season. Thank you so much.